back year 8 to lesson number 2 in our topic Miracle of Life. Last lesson, you gave me a story of the start of your life, of your birth, and the interesting things that occurred. And that was fantastic because it gave us a perspective about this life journey. We're going to move a little bit further on, and that's where that blue arrow at the bottom you see there is going. We're going to move a little bit further on in this growth aspect of this topic, but in essence, recognize that this is a historical concept and a historical thought. So today is all about a little bit of history. Let's do a bit of background. Firstly, reminder, your human body cells are numerous. There's lots of different types: bone and brain and heart cells and red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets, etc. There are 37 trillion cells in your body. And each and every moment, some cells die, some cells need to be replaced. That's probably due to your hair that you're brushing and you take out some hair cells. Your skin cells are wiped off from your towel after you shower, and your cells die if you cut your skin or you might burn it. We are a multicellular organism, so therefore those 37 trillion cells need to be replaced at some point. This brings to us an interesting historical question. How? How does your body grow and repair itself? Now that might seem to you quite a simple answer. We already know what that might be, but actually historically we didn't. Well, they thought they didn't. Well, they thought they actually had a interesting answer to the problem, but really we've proven that wrong. And today we're going to explore that historical problem, and it's to do with the word spontaneous generation. Before 1870, they thought that how your cells were made, how you were made, how other organisms were made, living things, came from non-life, non-living matter. So how did that come about? Well, before 1870, they thought that this theory of spontaneous generation was how things came alive. Non-living turned into living. And Aristotle, famous philosopher, Greek philosopher in the 4th century, actually coined this idea first and foremost when he was thinking through how things came to be. One idea that was an observation of his and others was life came from non-living matter. For example, worms spontaneously came from soil. That was a good observation, not to be laughed at, even though we know where now worms come from, their life cycle, what they need to have in order to have worms be in the soil first off. We need other worms, don't we? But they didn't recognize that, didn't have the observational techniques in order to perceive that. So let's look at some ideas here that led them to this idea. So this is the concept today. Even though we know that life has to come from life, your cells have to come from other living cells. If you have bone cells, if you have hair cells that need to be repaired and replaced, they have to come from other hair and bone cells that are already there in the first place. But we have to understand that we didn't always have this perspective, but don't laugh at them for not having that perspective. We need to understand, well, why was that the case? And I guarantee you, the majority of you will have thought the exact same thing before 1870. It was just common knowledge. You weren't even thinking about it. It was just, well, that's the way it is. So let's look at some very real observations that they were observing at the time in their cultures, and look at why it was relevant, why it was appropriate for them to have this idea of spontaneous generation. So first and foremost, we have the observation where every year in the spring the Nile River flooded areas of Egypt around the river. Now, it left behind nutrient-rich mud that enabled those people to grow that year's crops for their food. But along that muddy soil, there was a large number of frogs that appeared, but they weren't there in those drier times. So that's the observation. So, what is the conclusion? Well, the conclusion is it was perfectly obvious to those people around the Nile back then that that muddy soil gave rise to the frogs. Hey presto, they thought that it was spontaneously generated out of the mud. Fair? I think that's a fair conclusion from their observations that they gave. Let's look at another one. In many parts of Europe, medieval farmers stored their grains in barns, which with a kind of thatched roofs like you might see in Shakespearean houses. As the roofs aged, it was not uncommon for those things to start leaking, and that then a lot of times could spoil the grain that was there and make it become moldy. And therefore, there was a lot of mice that were around at the exact same time. So, to those medieval farmers, it was obvious from their observations to conclude that the mice came from that moldy grain. Hey presto, they thought these mice spontaneously generated non-living to living. Last few. In the cities, this is a fun one. In the cities, there were no sewers at the time. There was no garbage trucks. There was no electricity. There was no fridges. Sewerage flowed in the gutters along the streets and the sidewalks. Those sidewalks were raised up a little bit sometimes to give those people a place to walk. At intersections of those streets, there was raised stepping stones that were placed to allow people walking across, those pedestrians, to cross the intersections. Yet they were spaced large enough that those carriages that were there at the time, those carriage wheels could pass between them as well. In the mornings, the contents of the toilets, the chamber pots that they were called, were tossed out into the nearest window onto the streets and onto the sidewalk. The food that was purchased and prepared every day, when people were done with eating those meals, the bones and the leftovers were also tossed out the window as well. Now, if you know a bit of chivalry at the time, chivalrous gentlemen always walked closest to the street when you were walking with a woman. So if a horse or a carriage came by and splattered up the filth that was in the gutter, it would land on him and not the lady's expensive silk gown that they might have been wearing at the time, because they weren't easily washable, and also there wasn't any washing machines around at the time, so they had to wash by hand. Many cities also had a major rat problem. People back then may not have been didn't kind of connect the presence of rats with kind of the spread of Black Death or bubonic plague. They were probably bothered by those rats kind of chewing on their things and rat fleas biting them as well. But people didn't realize that the plague was spread by biting of those fleas from those rats. But you'd imagine that if they only knew what that was from, they'd probably get rid of the rats as well, and the fleas would also disappear. Hence, if you know, the Pied Piper, that story leading all the rats out of town. Well, that kind of came from that idea. The observation, therefore, rats appeared because of the sewage and the garbage that was there, and so a quite common conclusion is the garbage and the sewage gave rise to those rats. Last one. We have, historically, there were no refrigerators. You took a daily trip to the butcher, especially in summer, to get your meat. The butchers also didn't have any refrigerators, so the meat was just left outside or left there, and there was no air conditioning either. So if it was getting hot in the summer in that butcher, the meat really and the butchers had to battle the flies that were hanging around those carcasses of meat. Typically, those pieces of meat were hung by the heels, and then this customer would come in and kind of select a chunk out of it, and the butcher would carve it off that carcass as well. So the observation was, well, the butchers had this raw meat, and yes, it might have started to rot and smell a little bit, had this raw meat out, and there was flies and there might have been maggots every so often. So an observation would be rotting meat gave rise to those maggots and those flies. Non-living meat gave rise to living things. Spontaneous generation. So I know, again, this is not what we think anymore, but can you understand that from a non-scientific perspective, when you don't have technologies to see what's going on, to observe it in a very logical manner, to discuss and prove via reasonable doubt, prove that life has to come from life, then this spontaneous generation idea really suits and fits the observations that they had around them at the time. Today we're going to explore that. So here, spontaneous generation was actually disproven by two very famous experiments. One from Francesco Redi, and it was his meat in a jar experiment, all right? And that's what you see on your left-hand side there. Redi's experiment, Francesco Redi, his meat in a jar experiment. And then also you've got Louis Pasteur and his famous swan neck experiment and broth that's in it as well. So what I want you to do, your activity today, is to research one, either Francesco Redi's meat in jar experiment, flies, or Louis Pasteur's swan neck flask experiment. And I want you to just spend 5 minutes finding out what happened, what that experiment was doing, what it was trying to show, what it was trying to prove, how it was doing it. So tell me all about one of those experiments, and especially after you've told me about the experiment, explain at least in 1 or 2 sentences, how therefore that experiment showed that life came from life, and it disproved that life couldn't come from non-living matter. So they essentially proved that biogenesis, life comes from life, was actually the reasonable expectation, the reasonable theory to come out of it, and disprove, therefore, spontaneous generation. All right, good luck. Submit your document when you can to the due work that has been set up for you. Have a great day.